Hello, everybody. Hope you're all continuing to wash your hands. I am sure after the last video, you were thinking that I am absolutely crazy because that thing lasted 2 hours. Just as a reminder, that normally would have taken 2 class periods. All right, so about 2 hours is normal there. Today's will be substantially shorter. All right, so today, where we are in the research process is we have written our survey, we have drawn our sample, we have collected data from that sample. All right, so in real life, our survey is currently out there in the world, having people answer it, hopefully. All right, but we are going to pretend for the purposes of today's talk that we have gotten some data back. All right, we have answers to our survey question, and now we have to take those answers and turn them into a database. All right, turn them into a spreadsheet that we can then use for our data analysis. All right, and so that's what we're going to talk about today, data coding and editing. All right, so before we can actually analyze all the data that we collected, we have to do some simple things to prepare it for that analysis. All right, and so there are 2 main steps here, editing the data and coding the data. All right, and while the phrase editing the data makes it sound like we're going to change people's answers, that's not what we're doing here. All right, so what we're doing in the data editing phase is we're making sure that all of the data that we collected is usable. All right, that people reported information in a way that we can analyze. All right, and so we're going to do some very simple things here. All right, so we're looking for things like we're going to convert all of the responses to consistent units. All right, so if you have ratio response measures on your survey, so you've provided a blank line and you've asked people to write a number in on that line, there is a very good chance that people are going to write a number in on that line in a format that's not exactly what you were anticipating. All right, so for example, if you ask someone how much they're willing to spend on something, some people might write just the number 10 to represent $10. Some people might write $10.00 with a dollar sign and everything. When we get to SPSS, all right, and this is going to be tricky because I am no longer requiring you guys to formally use SPSS, but I'm still going to show you how to use it in the event that you want to know. SPSS cannot read anything that is not a number. All right, so it can read numbers and it can read decimal places, but it cannot read commas or dollar signs or letters or anything like that. So we have to make sure that all of the answers that we get in these ratio response format measurement scales where we've provided a blank line and people wrote in a number, we need to make sure that responses are converted to consistent units that SPSS can read. All right, and this isn't unique to SPSS. This is the same for all statistical software. All right, so we're going to take the dollar signs off of answers. If people write things like their age is 18 and a half, we might want to convert that to 18 or 19. We might see things like if you ask someone how often they do something, they will write 1-2 times. All right, 1 to 2 times. 1-2 is not a number. All right, and SPSS can't read that. So you have to make a decision. Are we going to take the low end of their answer and record their answer as 1? Are we going to take the high end of their answer and record their answer as 2? Are we going to split the middle and say that they do this thing 1.5 times a week? All right, that's a decision that you have to make. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just that however you decide to do that, you have to be consistent. All right, across all of the respondents, make sure that you are converting those non-numerical answers to numerical answers in a consistent way. All right, we're also trying to assess degree of non-response in this editing phase. All right, and so a rule of thumb here is if a participant skipped more than half of the survey, we're just going to throw their survey out. All right, and so what we're looking for here is item non-response, where the respondent has returned the survey, but they've skipped individual questions on the survey. And if they've skipped just 1 or 2 questions, that's fine. All right, it's not ideal, but it's not something we're really concerned about. It's possible that they accidentally clicked their mouse too quickly, all right, and they skipped a question on accident. It's possible that they didn't have an answer to the question, and so instead of making something up, they just skipped it. That's good. We would prefer for them to do that. But if a respondent has skipped more than half of the survey, and where this often shows up is they'll answer the first 5 or 10 questions and then fail to answer the remainder of the survey, we have to wonder, why did they quit the survey? And were they paying attention to the questions that they did answer? And so to be conservative, to be safe here, we just toss their survey if they've skipped more than half of the survey. All right, we also want to look for evidence that the respondent wasn't taking the survey seriously. So even if they did turn in the entire survey, we can look for some easy things that clue us into how much attention were they really paying to what they were doing. All right, so if you have, 20 questions in order on your survey that ask people to respond to something on a 5-point scale, and someone circles 5 for every single question, or they circle 1 for every single question, they were probably not paying attention, right? They were probably just clicking through questions to get to the end of the survey. Similarly, if you see, a Christmas tree sort of pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 as the answers to all of the survey questions. Again, these people probably weren't paying attention, and that means that their answers are just error. All right, they don't really reveal their true feelings or their true behaviors. It's just a lie, basically. It's just a number that the person put in to get through the survey, and we don't want that messing up our data. All right, we only want to consider the numbers where it looks like someone was really taking the survey seriously. All right, what we're also looking for in this editing phase is, where possible, some consistency across responses. All right, and so this won't be possible in all surveys, but as an example, let's imagine that you were asking some survey questions, and in one question you asked people if they own a pet, and in another question you asked them if they buy dog food, and you see that 45% of respondents report buying dog food, but only 40% of them said they have a dog living in their home. That's a problem, all right? It makes you wonder, those other 5% of respondents, why are they buying, why are they saying that they buy dog food when they don't say that they have a dog, all right? It suggests that the participant may not have been reading questions closely, all right, might have just been clicking things to get through the survey. All right, so where possible, you can look to see, are people's answers, somewhat consistent, or are they showing up in a pattern that makes sense? All right, similarly, hopefully you have used branching questions to avoid this kind of product, but if a respondent says they've never used a product, but then in the next question report being very satisfied with that product they've never used, this is a problem. All right, you can't be very satisfied with a product that you've never tried. All right, finally in this editing phase, we are going to add a respondent code. All right, and so recall we talked about when we were writing the survey about how, and we were talking about ethics, about how the respondents' answers need to be confidential and anonymous. And part of that anonymity is that we do not record any information in the data set that could personally identify the person who belongs to that data, all right, whose answers we're looking at. And so what that means is that nowhere in our data set are we going to see anyone's name, their student ID number, social security number, etc. But we want some way to connect the line of data in our data set to the physical survey that was returned to us. And so what we do is we add a respondent code. All right, and so what you do, very simply, you have the survey that got returned, all right, you write up in the corner, this is respondent number 1, and then when you enter the data in the data set, the first column of data will ask for respondent number, and you would say, here's respondent 1, and here are all of their answers. Now the reason why we do this is, let's say that this column of data is for a question that was answered on a 1 to 9 scale, but when you entered the data, you accidentally typed in a 10 as their answer instead of 1. All right, so somehow you accidentally hit a 0 in here. When you're going back to do your data analysis, you might look at this and say, oh, 10's not even a possible answer to this question. Well, you know that this is from respondent 1, so you can go find respondent 1's survey, look at their answer to this question, and see they actually circled 1, all right, and this should be a 1 and not a 10. All right, so you're safeguarding yourself against a lot of additional work, having to re-enter all of the data if you find a mistake in your data set. All right, in the next phase, in the coding phase, what we're doing is we're taking people's answers and converting those answers into numbers. All right, and we're going to see that this coding phase maps pretty closely onto the measurement scales that we've already talked about, all right, about nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio response scales. But what we're doing here is, if the answer that someone has provided is not already a number, then we need to find a way to convert their answer into a number so that we can enter that number into the data set. All right, because again, SPSS cannot read words. All right, it can't read things like male and female, all right, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. So we have to find some way to convert those responses into numbers, and the way that we do that depends on the measurement scale that was used for any particular question. All right, when you use a nominal response scale, all right, this says binary, but we can think about this more generally as all nominal response scales. And again, I apologize that my mouse writing is so hideous. What is typically done is to use a 0 or a 1 for the first response option that was presented, and then just count up by 1 for each additional category. All right, so if your options are male, female, this might look like 0, 1. If you additionally have an other category here, then this might be 0, 1, 2. All right, yes or no is often coded 0 for no and 1 for yes. If you ask people if they are a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, grad student, then this might look like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so what we're doing here is we're just applying a number to their answer. The number itself does not mean anything. It only says if we see a 1 in the data set, that tells us that that person who answered the question was a freshman, right? And this could be a 1 or it could be 1,000 or 225. As we discussed before when we talked about nominal response scales, it does not matter what number we use here because the number is only a label. All right, we can't add these numbers up or multiply or divide them or do any of those things. All right, so when we have this nominal data, you just assign numbers to each category consistently. All right, so every single answer, every single survey has those numbers applied in the same way, and then we enter them into the data set. When you use interval response scales, all right, so use those itemized rating scales on a scale from 1 to 9, how much do you agree or disagree with something? You simply enter the number that they circled. All right, so we already have numbers here. The number already has some meaning related to the anchor that was placed on the scale, and so we just enter that number into the data set. The textbook talks about reverse coding. I'm not going to belabor that point here because we don't use any reverse coding on our survey, I don't think. If we end up using reverse coding, then we'll talk about that when we get there later. But you can look to the textbook, all right, to read more about this topic. It's hard to do without a board. All right, one place where I think it's worth talking about a little more is what to do when you ask people to answer something and check all answers that apply. All right, so let's say that you gave people 3 options for reasons why they did something, and you ask someone to check all of the options that apply, and somebody circles options 1 and options 2. There's this question of, well, how are we going to enter this into our data set? All right, and so if this is question 1 on the survey, we have this column of data in our data set, and we want to report that respondent number 1 circled 1 and 2. We could enter 1, 2. The problem with that is that comma is not a number. All right, so SPSS would not look at this and recognize that respondent 1 circled 1 and 2. All right, they would look at this and say this is a word. All right, they wouldn't be able to recognize what was happening, and they wouldn't be able to do any analysis. All right, so what happens when we have check all that apply questions is instead of having a single variable to represent people's answers, you have a variable for each possible answer. All right, so we would have Q1 underscore 1, Q1 underscore 2, and Q1 underscore 3. Ooh. And here, if they circle it, we're going to code that as a 1. And if they fail to circle it, we're going to code that as a 0. So essentially what's happening here is we can think of this as we asked 3 separate questions. Was this a reason why you did something? Yes or no. Was this a reason why you did it? Yes or no. Was this a reason why you did it? Yes or no. And this person said these were reasons, the first and second option, but the third was not a reason. All right, so this person will get a 1 for Q11, a 1 for Q12, and a 0 for Q13. All right, and so we would have this string of 1s and 0s that correspond to a yes or no coding scheme. Did they circle option A? Did they circle option B? Did they circle option C? All right, and that's how we deal with these check all that apply questions. So we have to make sure that we're assigning only one number as their answer to each variable in the data set. Otherwise, SPSS won't be able to deal with that. All right, when on the last screen we talked about what to do when you have nominal data, what to do when you have interval response data. We also have to deal with open-ended responses. All right, so because open-ended responses don't provide response categories for participants, they don't have a thing that they have to circle on the survey, we have to create those categories after the fact based on whatever they wrote in on that line. Now, when we are using ratio response measures, this is pretty easy because hopefully what they wrote in on that line was a number. All right, and so we talked about a couple slides ago, like maybe they don't use perfect numbers, but if they did what they were supposed to do and just wrote a number in on that line, then you just take that number that they wrote and enter that into your data set. The tricky part comes in when you use open-ended questions where people can write in words. All right, and so I'm going to show you very briefly, right, there's entire courses that you can take on how to deal with this kind of qualitative data. I'm just going to show you briefly how to deal with it, but what you'll see here is that it's not easy. All right, and so this is why I asked that you guys not include any of these kinds of questions on your survey. All right, so let's imagine we have a survey question where we ask students, in your own words, give us 2 or 3 reasons why you would prefer to leave the state after graduation. All right, so you're just asking, what are some reasons why you might choose to leave Mississippi after you graduate? And so you get all kinds of answers that people have provided, and now we have to figure out a way to take all of those verbal responses that you got, all those words, and convert them into numbers. All right, so the first step, you're going to go through each survey and highlight each unique answer to the question, right? Like literally highlight. With a highlighter, you would take out a highlighter, and every time you see a unique answer, you would highlight that unique answer. Key thing when you're doing this is that you need to have at least 2 people doing this independently. All right, so everybody does it on their own, and then they meet up and look to see, did we highlight the same things? So you're not just letting one person's potential opinion or bias influence how this data gets coded. You have 2 people doing it and checking their answers. Once you've highlighted all the unique answers that you saw, you need to go through all of those unique answers and look for patterns. All right, so did people tend to give similar kinds of responses where you could then categorize those kinds of responses? All right, so for example, to this question, why you might prefer to leave the state after graduation, you might see answers about, I want to move to live near my parents or my sister or my boyfriend or girlfriend or my best friend. All right, so there's some person who lives somewhere and they're deliberately leaving the state to move near that person. Somebody might say something like, I've always lived in Mississippi and I just want to live somewhere different, or I've always wanted to live in Nashville or something, right? And so they are giving an answer about just wanting something new. Or you would probably expect to see a lot of answers about because I got a job, because I got into grad school, etc. So there's some specific program that they're entering somewhere and they need to move for that. When you come up with these descriptive category labels, just like when we were talking about writing nominal response options, the category labels need to be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So every answer that you highlighted needs to fit into one and only one of these categories that you've created. So you need to be able to categorize every answer, and you can use an other category to capture the sort of unusual responses that you get. But also the categories need to be descriptive enough that each answer only fits into one. All right, so you couldn't say, well, this might be move near loved one, but it might also be job offer. All right, it's clear that each answer fits into one and only one of these categories. All right, once you've done that, you've now created the category labels. The next step is to go back to all of those answers that you highlighted on all of your surveys and now assign those responses to the categories that you've created. So you have this list of hundreds and hundreds of answers that you got, and for each one you say, is this answer move near a loved one, change of scenery, job offer, other, and you code each one with that. All right, again, here you would use multiple coders, so multiple people would put these options into these categories. And then at the end, typically what happens is those people would meet up, they would compare their answers, and then in the report you would say, we used multiple coders, they agreed on the coding 97% of the time, and the 3% that they couldn't agree on, they met up, all right, to decide how things should be coded. All right, and so then once you do that, you have now converted this to numbers. All right, you might say move near a loved one, we're going to code that as 1. Change of scenery, we're going to code that as 2. Job offer, we're going to code that as 3. Other, we'll code that as 4. All right, and so now you've taken all of these verbal qualitative responses that people have provided, and you have converted those into numbers so that you can then analyze which numbers were more common, did certain people tend to give certain kinds of answers, etc. This is a lengthy process, all right? It takes a long time. It's really tedious. This is why I said don't put this on your survey, all right, because we just don't have time to deal with this semester. All right, once you have coded all of the data into the data set, it's helpful to create something called a code book. All right, and when you guys get all of the data for your survey and I then send you the survey data set, I will provide you guys with this code book so that you understand what all of the numbers in the data set mean. When you create a code book, you print a clean copy of your survey. In the margins of the survey, you write the variable names that you'll use next to each question. All right, so if this were a question, I might write in the margin over here that this is going to get labeled Q1 in the data set. This would get labeled Q2. All right, and then for each answer that people could have answered, all right, like let's say this was a question asking about gender, so we see male and female as the response options under the question, then you would write on the survey, here's how this was coded. Then you're going to open a Word document. Let me erase this. And in the Word document, you're going to create 3 columns. In those columns, the first column would have all of the variable names. In the middle column, you would have some description of the variable, all right? Because if you just see Q1 in the data set, you don't know what Q1 means, all right? You haven't memorized every single variable from the survey, so you would constantly have to be flipping back to the survey to see what did Q1 mean. So it's helpful to have this description of the variable, all right? So for example, this might say Q1, and this measures gender. This looks horrible and I apologize. And then in the third column, you would have the possible response options like 1 equals female and 0 equals male. Right? And so you would have this table that has this information for every variable in the data set. And this is just like a reference, all right, that you use when you're doing the data analysis so that you know without having to constantly flip back to the survey, here's what all of these variables in the data set mean. All right, the last thing to think about when creating this data set before we actually do the data analysis is what are we going to do when people skipped questions on the survey? All right, and so previously in the editing phase, we said if somebody skips half of the survey or more, we're just going to toss their survey, or we're not even going to look at their answers when we do the analysis. But what do we do when somebody skips just 1 or 2 questions? So we don't want to throw out all of their answers, but we have to figure out what to do when someone has skipped, all right, 1 or more questions on the survey. One way that you can get around this is by forcing responses, all right? And so this is not an option when you mail someone a survey. There's no way to force someone to answer questions to a mailed survey, but in an online survey, as in our Qualtrics survey, there is an option to force a response, which means that if the person taking the survey does not answer the question, then they are unable to advance from that screen. And you guys have probably seen this when you fill out forms online and you think you filled everything out and you click submit, but then it comes back and says, you know, in red, it'll say, you know, please enter, you know, whatever information you forgot to fill in. That's the survey forcing a response. All right, and so if you force a response, you won't have any item non-response because people can't skip individual questions. The problem, though, is that if someone really doesn't want to answer a question on a survey, all right, either because they don't have an answer or it's embarrassing or sensitive and they don't want to provide that information, if you force them to provide an answer, they're either going to lie so that they can continue on with the survey, or they're going to get frustrated and quit the entire survey. All right, and neither one of those are desirable options. All right, so forcing responses is possible, all right, and I often do use forced responses in surveys that I write if it's a question where I think that people should have no problem answering it, or if it's one of the key things that we're interested in for the survey. All right, for example, in our survey, respondents are going to be forced to answer whether they have an ADHD diagnosis or whether they have a valid prescription, whether they've ever used it, because if they don't answer those basic questions, then it's going to be, you know, the rest of their answers are sort of worthless to us because, you know, they're not even going to get routed to the correct part of the survey. All right, so if you don't force responses, and as a result, you have some questions where people have skipped those questions and not provided an answer, there are different ways that you can handle that. All right, the first option is to eliminate the case. That's just SPSS language for the person. Eliminate that person who skipped a question from all analyses. All right, so if they miss even 1 question on the survey, we're just tossing them. We're not even going to look at their data. This is an extreme, you know, sort of approach, but it's an approach that you can take. The default that SPSS uses is to eliminate that person from any analyses using the variable they skipped. All right, so if we're trying to calculate the proportion of people who have tried ADHD medication and some people skipped that question, then those people who skipped it would not be included in the calculation of the proportion of people who have tried it. All right, so we just ignore people who skipped a question when we do an analysis that involves that question. All right, and this is what we're going to do in class because it's what SPSS defaults to. All right, sometimes if it's really important to you that you have a complete data set where no one has skipped anything, you can substitute values for missing items. So if if somebody doesn't answer a question that was measured on a 9-point scale, you could just take the average of everyone else's responses and put that in as the missing value. All right, so it's a way to make sure that you have no missing data points. We're not going to go that far. Additionally, if you have contact information linked to the respondent's information, you could contact them again. All right, so you could call them or you could email them and say, you skipped question 14 on the survey. Would you mind returning to that question and providing us with an answer? All right, so that's certainly an option. All right, at this point, this is the last slide. I don't have another slide after this to be kind of like a wrap-up thing. So I will just say here that after this lecture, we're going to get into statistics. All right, and so I'm looking at the syllabus, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days, all right, of talking about statistics. This, honestly, I don't, at the time of me recording this, I don't know how I'm going to do this yet, all right, to be completely honest. I don't know how to do this without a chalkboard. All right, so I'm going to try to figure out how to do this with video teleconferencing software downstairs so that you guys can see my computer screen so that I can move back and forth between PowerPoint and SPSS and a whiteboard type app. But we'll see. You guys won't know that this is happening because something will just get posted, but hopefully you guys are doing okay with this video format. If you guys have questions about the class generally, if you have questions about specific content of slides or anything else related to the course or anything not related to the course, please feel free to reach out to me. My office hours are not generally very popular, but I am happy to have Zoom office hours. I imagine lots of your other professors are using Zoom for various things, so I'm happy to have teleconferencing for office hours, and we'll figure that out as we go along. But we have the first 2 lectures now online. Hopefully you guys are all washing your hands and doing what you're supposed to do, staying inside so that one day we can go outside again. I miss all of you guys, and I'll see you next time to talk about descriptive statistics, and it is going to be exciting. All right, so get ready for it.